and welcome. Tonight we're reading Dracula by Bram Stoker. So I'm pretty sure Dracula does not need any introduction. The story of Dracula and Dracula as a character is pretty much embedded in pop culture. He's been featured in theatrical, literary, and film adaptations. Among them are the 1931 film Dracula starring actor Bela Lugosi, and the 1922 feature Nosferatu starring Max Schreck. Those two early screen successes basically propelled the vampire myth to the forefront of popular culture. So a little bit about Bram Stoker. He was born in 1847 in Ireland and studied mathematics at Dublin's Trinity College and became an assistant to actor Sir Henry Irving in the 1870s. Irving offered Stoker a management position at his production company / venue in England, the famous Lyceum Theatre in London's West End. In 1875, Stoker published what became his first novel, The Primrose Path. He continued to publish writings while managing the Lyceum Theatre, including the short story collection Under the Sunset in 1882 and his second novel, The Snake's Pass, in 1890. In 1897, Stoker published his masterpiece, Dracula. While the book was popular after its release, it didn't achieve its peak popularity until well after Stoker's death. After Dracula, Stoker continued to write, and he wrote a total of 12 novels in his lifetime, including The Mystery of the Sea in 1902, The Jewel of Seven Stars in 1904, and The Lair of the White Worm in 1911, which was later published under the title The Garden of Evil. Stoker served as Lyceum's manager for nearly 30 years until Irving's death in 1905. Unfortunately, he suffered a stroke shortly afterwards, and he spent many of his final years battling his poor health and shaky finances. Stoker died on April 20th, 1912, with various reports citing the cause as complications from a stroke, exhaustion, or syphilis. But his legacy has endured through this most famous work, which we're reading tonight, Dracula. So a little bit about Dracula, if you don't already know all about Dracula. This book is what is called an epistolary novel, which means it's written through letters, diary entries, newspaper clippings, things like that. And it tells the tale, in the first part, of Jonathan Harker, who travels to Transylvania to meet a certain count. The story is told through Harker's diary entries, talking about his travels and the strange encounters he's been having along the way as he gets closer to the Count's castle. Unfortunately for Harker, he doesn't quite understand what he's getting himself into, and the story has to be picked up by other people who continue to tell it. So we're going to be skipping over the first few entries, which simply describe his journey to Transylvania, some of his impressions of the culture he's seeing, some of his impressions of the people he's seeing, and quite a few memos to himself to get things for Mina, which is his loving wife. So, let's pick it up in one of the later entries where he describes his departure from Bistritz, which is the hotel right before his journey to the castle, and his rather exciting coach ride to finally meet the Count. So, with all that out of the way, let's get into the story, shall we? Dracula by Bram Stoker. May 4th. I found that my landlord had got a letter from the Count directing him to secure the best place on the coach for me. But on making inquiries as to the details, he seemed somewhat reticent, and pretended that he could not understand my German. This could not be true, because up to then he had understood it perfectly. At least he answered my questions exactly as if he did. He and his wife, the old lady who had received me, looked at each other in a frightened sort of way. He mumbled out that the money had been sent in a letter, and that was all he knew. When I asked him if he knew Count Dracula, and could tell me anything of his castle, both he and his wife crossed themselves, and saying they knew nothing at all, simply refused to speak further. It was so near the time of starting that I had no time to ask anyone else.
for it was all very mysterious and not by any means comforting. Just before I was leaving, the old lady came up to my room and said in a very hysterical way, "Must you go? Oh, young hare, must you go?" She was in such an excited state that she seemed to have lost her grip of what German she knew, and mixed it all up with some other language which I did not know at all. I was just able to follow her by asking many questions. When I told her that I must go at once, and that I was engaged on an important business, she asked again, "Do you know what day it is?" I answered that it was the 4th of May. She shook her head as she said again, "Oh yes, I know that, but do you know what day it is?" On my saying that I did not understand, she went on, "It is the eve of St. George's Day. Do you not know that tonight, when the clock strikes midnight, all the evil things in the world will have full sway? Do you know where you are going, and what you are going to?" She was in such evident distress that I tried to comfort her, but without effect. Finally, she went down on her knees and implored me not to go, at least to wait a day or two before starting. It was all very ridiculous, but I did not feel comfortable. However, there was business to be done, and I could allow nothing to interfere with it. I therefore tried to raise her up, and said as gravely as I could that I thanked her, but my duty was imperative and that I must go. She then rose and dried her eyes, and taking a crucifix from her neck, offered it to me. I did not know what to do, for, as an English churchman, I had been taught to regard such things as in some measure idolatrous, and yet it seemed so ungracious to refuse an old lady's meanings so well, and in such a state of mind. She saw, I suppose, the doubt in my face, for she put the rosary round my neck and said, "For your mother's sake," and went out of the room. I am writing up this part of the diary whilst I am waiting for the coach, which is, of course, late, and the crucifix is still round my neck. Whether it is the old lady's fear, or the many ghostly traditions of this place, or the crucifix itself, I do not know, but I am not feeling nearly as easy in my mind as usual. If this book should ever reach Mina before I do, let it bring my goodbye. Here comes the coach. May 5th, the castle. The gray of the morning has passed, and the sun is high over the distant horizon, which seems jagged, whether with trees or hills I know not, for it is so far off that big things and little are mixed. I am not sleepy, and as I am not to be called till I awake, naturally I write till sleep comes. There are many odd things to put down, and lest who reads them may fancy that I dined too well before I left Bistritz. Let me put down my dinner exactly. I dined on what they call robber steak, bits of bacon, onion, and beef, seasoned with red pepper, and strung on sticks and roasted over the fire, in the simple style of the London cat's meat. The wine was golden mariage, which produces a queer sting on the tongue, which is, however, not disagreeable. I had only a couple glasses of this, and nothing else. When I got on the coach, the driver had not taken his seat, and I saw him talking with the landlady. They were evidently talking of me, for every now and then they looked at me, and some of the people who were sitting on the bench outside the door, which they called by a name meaning word-bearer, came and listened, and then all looked at me, most of them pityingly. I could hear a lot of words, often repeated, queer words, for there were many nationalities in the crowd. So I quietly got my polyglot dictionary from my bag and looked them out. I must say they were not cheering to me, for amongst them were Ordog, Satan, Pokol, Hell, Stragosha, Witch, Verlok, and Vlkoslak, both of which mean the same thing, one being Slovak and the other Servian, for something that is either werewolf or vampire. Memo: I must ask the Count about these superstitions. When we started, the crowd round the inn door, which had by this time swelled to a considerable size, all made the sign of the cross and pointed 2 fingers towards me. With some difficulty, I got a fellow passenger to tell me what they meant. He would not answer at first, but on learning that I was English, he explained that it was a charm or guard against the evil eye. This was not very pleasant for me, just starting for an unknown place to meet an unknown man, but everyone seemed so kind-hearted and so sorrowful and so sympathetic that I could not but be touched. I shall never forget the last glimpse which I had of the inn-yard and its crowd of picturesque figures, all crossing themselves as they stood round the wide archway, with its background of rich foliage of oleander and orange trees in green tubs clustered in the center of the yard. Then our driver, whose wide linen drawers covered the whole front of the box seat, Gotza, they call them, cracked his big whip over his 4 small horses, which ran abreast, and we set off on our journey.
I soon lost sight and recollection of ghostly fears and the beauty of the scene as we drove along.
Although, had I known the language, or rather languages, which my fellow passengers were speaking, I might not have been able to throw them off so easily. Before us lay a green sloping land full of forests and woods, with here and there steep hills crowned with clumps of trees, or with farmhouses, the blank gable end to the road. There was everywhere a bewildering mass of fruit blossom, apple, plum, pear, cherry, and as we drove by, I could see the green grass under the trees spangled with the fallen petals. In and out amongst these green hills of what they call here the Mittelland ran the road, losing itself as it swept around the grassy curve or was shut out by the straggling ends of pine woods, which here and there ran down the hillsides like tongues of flame. The road was rugged, but still we seemed to fly over with a feverish haste. I could not understand then what that haste meant, but the driver was evidently bent on losing no time in reaching Borgo Prund. I was told that this road is in summertime excellent, but that it had not yet been put in order after the winter snows.
In this respect, it is different from the general run of roads in the Carpathians, for it is an old tradition that they are not to be kept in too good order. Of old, the hospitallers would not repair them, lest the Turk should think that they were preparing to bring in foreign troops, and so hasten the war which was already really at loading point. Beyond the green swelling hills of the Mittelland rose mighty slopes of forest up to the lofty steeps of the Carpathians themselves. Right and left of us they towered, with the afternoon sun falling full upon them, and bringing out all the glorious colors of this beautiful range, deep blue and purple in the shadows of the peaks, green and brown where grass and rock mingled, and an endless perspective of jagged rock and pointed crags, till these were themselves lost in the distance,
where the snowy peaks rose grandly. Here and there seemed mighty rifts in the mountains,
through which, as the sun began to sink, we saw now and again the white gleam of falling water.
One of my companions touched my arm as we swept round the base of a hill and opened up the lofty snow-covered peak of a mountain, which seemed, as we wound on our serpentine way, to be right before us. "Look, Istinsek, God's seat," and he crossed himself reverently. As we wound on our endless way and the sun sank lower and lower behind us, the shadows of the evening began to creep round us. This was emphasized by the fact that the snowy mountain top still held the sunset and seemed to glow out with a delicate cool pink.
Here and there we passed Sussex and Slovaks, all in picturesque attire,
but I noticed that goiter was painfully prevalent. By the roadside were many crosses, and as we swept by, my companions all crossed themselves. Here and there was a peasant man or woman kneeling before a shrine, who did not even turn round as we approached, but seemed in the self-surrender of devotion to have neither eyes nor ears for the outer world.
There were many things new to me. For instance, hayricks in the trees, and here and there very beautiful masses of weeping birch,
their white stems shining like silver through the delicate green of the leaves. Now and again we passed a leader wagon, the ordinary peasant's cart, with its long snake-like vertebrae, calculated to suit the inequalities of the road. On this were sure to be seated quite a group of homecoming peasants. The Sussex with their white, and the Slovaks with their colored sheepskins, the latter carrying lance-fashion their long staves with axe at the end. As the evening fell, it began to get very cold, and the growing twilight seemed to merge into one dark mistiness, the gloom of the trees, oak, beech, and pine. Though in the valleys which ran deep between the spurs of the hill, as we ascended through the pass, the dark firs stood out here and there against the background of late-lying snow.
Sometimes, as the road was cut through the pine woods that seemed in the darkness to be closing down upon us, great masses of grayness,
which here and there bestrewed the trees, produced a particularly weird and solemn effect, which carried on the thoughts and grim fancies engendered earlier in the evening. when the falling sunset threw into strange relief the ghost-like clouds which among the Carpathians seemed to wind ceaselessly through the valleys. Sometimes the hills were so steep that despite our driver's haste, the horses could only go slowly.
I wished to get down and walk up to them, as we do at home, but the driver would not hear of it.
"No, no," he said, "you must not walk here. The dogs are too fierce." And then he added, with what he evidently meant for grim pleasantry, for he looked round to catch the approving smile of the rest, "And you may have enough of such matters before you go to sleep." The only stop he would make was a moment's pause to light his lamps.
When it grew dark, there seemed to be some excitement amongst the passengers, and they kept speaking to him, one after the other, as though urging him to further speed.
He lashed the horses unmercifully with his long whip, and with wild cries of encouragement urged them on to further exertions. Then through the darkness I could see a sort of patch of gray light ahead of us, as though there were a cleft in the hills. The excitement of the passengers grew greater. The crazy coach rocked on its great leather springs and swayed like a boat tossed on stormy sea. I had to hold on. The road grew more level, and we appeared to fly along. Then the mountains seemed to come nearer to us on each side and to frown down upon us. We were entering on the Burgo Pass. One by one, several of the passengers offered me gifts,
which they pressed upon me with an earnestness which would take no denial.
They were certainly of an odd and varied kind, but each one was given in a simple good faith, with a kindly word and a blessing,
and that strange mixture of fear-meaning movements which I had seen outside the hotel at Bistritz.
The sign of the cross and the guard against the evil eye. And on each side the passengers, craning over the edge of the coach, peered eagerly into the darkness. It was evident that something very exciting was either happening or expected, but though I asked each passenger, no one would give me the slightest explanation.
This state of excitement kept on for some little time, and at last we saw before us the pass opening out on the eastern side. There were dark rolling clouds overhead, and in the air the heavy oppressive sense of thunder. It seemed as though the mountain range had separated two atmospheres, and that now we had got into the thunderous one.
I was now myself looking out for the conveyance which was to take me to the Count. Each moment I expected to see the glare of lamps through the blackness. But all was dark. The only light was the flickering rays of our own lamps, in which the steam from our hard-driven horses rose in a white cloud. We could see the sandy road laying white before us, but there was on it no sign of a vehicle. The passengers drew back with a sigh of gladness, which seemed to mock my own disappointment. I was already thinking what I had best do, when the driver, looking at his watch, said to the others something which I could hardly hear. It was spoken so quietly and in so low a tone, I thought it was an hour less than the time. Then turning to me, he said in German worse than my own, "There is no carriage here.
The Herr is not expected after all.
He will come on now to Bukovina, and return tomorrow, or the next day, better the next day." Whilst he was speaking, the horses began to neigh and snort and plunge wildly, so that the driver had to hold them up. Then, amongst a chorus of screams from the peasants, and a universal crossing of themselves, a calais with 4 horses drove up behind us, overtook us, and drew up beside the coach. I could see from the flash of our lamps, as the rays fell on them, that the horses were coal-black and splendid animals. They were driven by a tall man, with a long brown beard and a great black hat, which seemed to hide his face from us. I could only see the gleam of a pair of very bright eyes, which seemed red in the lamplight as he turned to us.
So that was the beginning of Dracula. And we did meet a very interesting person, as this coach has been flying along at breakneck speeds. Apparently they were expected after all. Unfortunately for Jonathan. I hope you enjoyed.